It is what it is.
Good morning, everybody. Why don't we go ahead and get started here? I know everybody's actually here for the tacos, so there's more tacos back there. How's everybody doing this morning? Good. So I've got a few announcements and then we'll get going with stuff. I really appreciate everybody's being here today. This has become a bit of a tradition for us of doing this during Forensic Science Week and doing some symposium relative to things that cross not just the forensic science area, but those things that cross into other stakeholders. The lab is one part of a much larger system. We lab nerds like to think we actually run everything, but we don't. And it is what we do is impacted by what other stakeholders do, and what we do impacts what other stakeholders do. So the ultimate goal of everything is how do we get the most effective, fairest, most just result out the other end. But we all have to look at what our contribution is and what our impacts are. So evidence management, I think, is a big chunk of that. Before I get too far, I most certainly want to thank Rice University and the Department of Multicultural Community Relations and Public Affairs for co-sponsoring this. In particular, Director David Medina and Assistant Director Jan West and Jordan Nichols, Event Planning Specialist. Thank you very much for your efforts in making this happen.
Well done.
There are a couple of things just to make sure. I know we've got some law enforcement here. We've got some attorneys here for TCOL credits. Please make sure you sign up for your TCOL credits at the back, and the same thing for CLEs. We've got a sign-up list at the back for that, because we've got both CLE and TCOL credits available for this. I think that's all I've got on my list here of things. Oh, there are, for questions, because we're kind of in a big echoey room, there are some cards on the tables, one way to ask questions, and then we will have a couple of microphones going around. If you could raise your hand, make sure we get a microphone to you so that people can hear the questions. So with that, we've got each of the speaker bios are in the program, so I won't read them out to you, but it's I think we've ended up with a really good panel that covers accreditation, other property management rooms, as well as HPD's property management room, which is a huge operation here. Some aspects with sexual assault kits, and also the prosecutor viewpoint of this. So kind of, again, covering all of the stakeholders. So I guess I'm the one that starts off. Get to the right place here. Nope, not that one. That one. Hi. So as the lab nerd, I have spent 20-something years in forensic sciences now. I started my career as a naval officer running one of the Navy's drug screening laboratories, which is basically a large-scale workplace drug testing lab. We ran about 1 million samples a year. And I went from there to a commercial laboratory, and I went from there to a not-for-profit research institute that handled accreditation of workplace drug testing laboratories. And I find myself talking with policy makers and decision makers all over the country about, yes, there are very real science issues in forensic science. Mixture interpretation, how many points of minutia make a legitimate evaluation of a fingerprint. Real science issues. But the 80% problem isn't a science problem. It is an evidence problem. I can't fix damaged evidence. It doesn't matter how good the science is. If the evidence that comes in the door is damaged, I can't fix that. Probably what I have seen hose up laboratories, and some of the things I have seen over my career that have been the biggest problems in laboratories aren't science problems, they're sample mix-ups. I've seen that in every laboratory I've worked in, every laboratory I've been through have been sample mix-ups. So I have an example here talking through what we've got here in Houston some, but really in toxicology. But oops, I've got the wrong, sorry. Technology at its finest. Oh, yeah, turn it on. There we go. On switch. How many degrees? And I can't figure out an on switch. Spent all them years in school for nothing, apparently. Things that are essential in evidence handling. I mean, it's not rocket surgery. But it is anything but easy, and this is something I try to point out, particularly to advocacy groups, that get a little strongly opinionated. This is not easy to do this hundreds, if not millions of times a year. Unambiguous identification, that it's actually identified correctly to the correct case, to the correct person, that is not nearly as trivial as it sounds. Tamper evidence, that how it's packaged, I can tell if it has been handled without somebody's knowledge. Packaged in such a fashion to protect the value of that particular type of evidence. Not everything can be packaged the same way, and if it's not packaged, it's going to damage and lose its value, and I can't fix that. Chain of custody. Anybody in this room not heard of a chain of custody? Good. If you haven't, see me after, we'll explain. And this one, I say a failure rate of something less than 1%. I think failure rate should be something significantly less than that, like 1 in 10,000. But the failure rate in evidence handling needs to be something in the per mil range, a 1 in 1,000 kind of event. And that's because of the efficiencies, that's because of the costs, that's because of if it's not at least that accurate coming in the door, the rest of the process has no prayer of being at least that accurate. So I'm using toxicology as the example because in toxicology, it's related enough to clinical laboratory stuff that in the 80s, Clinical Laboratory Improvement Act was a response to the fact that in clinical laboratories there were all kinds of issues. In the 70s and 80s, there were 60 Minutes articles and all of these things about mixed up samples, wrong results reported with samples, results not making it where they were supposed to, and poor clinical outcomes of that. People died. So it's not really that dissimilar to what we do. I tell people often, it's not hyperbolic to say if a lab gets something wrong, people die. If a lab gets something late, people die. This has huge impact. So it's really pretty similar to clinical stuff. But this CLIA has a lot of requirements specifically about sample handling, sample labeling. So when you go to the doctor, watch, what's the first thing you do when they're taking a blood sample? They will sit there with the labeling, and they're doing it one-to-one with the tubes, and they will read you, can you please confirm your name and your birth date, or some other piece of information. 2 separate identifiers, and then they label those tubes. So the tube itself is labeled with your name, and they've confirmed that before. That's all CLIA. That's all federally required stuff. We don't have that in forensics. Same impact, very different requirements. So, toxicology here. 2015, about the time I came in, okay, I'm a toxicologist, coming from this experience of having seen stuff go badly awry in other toxicology labs, and what I was seeing was we were receiving samples that were not unambiguously identified. My hair fell out, and we said we're going to stop that. So what we said in July of 2015, what we enacted at that point, and this is I want to make a point of this because it is characteristic of the rest of the effort that we've got to do. We simply said, if it says Bob on the tube and Martha on the paperwork, that's a problem. We're going to stop everything there. I'm going to return the evidence to you with a report that says I rejected it. If you submit a toothbrush to me for toxicology, that's not an appropriate sample, we're going to return that to you and say it's rejected. Those 2 things had to be unambiguously identified and had to be the appropriate sample. When we implemented that, we started rejecting half of everything that came in. Let that number sink in. So between July and April, basically, that had a catastrophic effect on the entire adjudication of DUIs. I had irate lawyers, I had irate law enforcement, I had irate judges. We had judges threatening to throw us in contempt of court because all we were doing was saying, I'm not going to test something that says Bob on the tube and Martha on the paperwork. I'm not going to test a toothbrush for toxicology. Spent a lot of time with training, a lot of time trying to refine this. We could get it down to about a 20% rejection rate through training and just trying to work at that. So keep this in mind. Training, effort, focus, I think can get you about to a 20% error rate. So we took a look then at what else we're going to be able to do. We took a look at the engineering of the collection kit. This was the legacy collection kit at the time. It had a lot of parts, and it had no fewer than 6 places where an officer had to fill in the subject's name, and name was what linked the sample tubes over there on the left to the entire case. So if they misspelled a name on the tube from everything else, I now have an ambiguous identification. And so we had lots of challenges of just how far away is too far away to be a sufficient unambiguous identifier. But you're setting everybody up to make an error with that much stuff. So we spent months re-engineering the kit down to something that looks like this. This is what we're using now. So it's got one form and one place where the agency case number and the name go, and that's it. So the form itself has, that bottom pink part there, form these seals that become the evidence seal on the tube, and that seal has a pre-labeled specific ID number and a barcode that links it to the form. So that label now positively links the sample itself to the form and the agency case number. This took months to re-engineer this. We've spent time making sure that the adhesive and the paper and all of these things about that form work to do this thousands of times a year. And it's made some improvements. So here is the error rate plotted by month over the 4 years we've been working at this. We went from 50% to 20%, just trying to basically brute force train. The break in there is because we had some instrument issues and we were not processing samples for that period of time. That was the period of time we were redesigning the kit as well, so we put the new kit in. And over time, we've now been able to get it down to about an average 2% rejection rate. And it has held stubbornly there at 2% for 2.5 years. So think about this. All of the training, all of the effort, 4 years of effort, re-engineering the kit. I spend about $40,000 a year on kits because I purchase the kits, I manage the kits for the agencies. We still have a 2% error rate because we see stuff like this. So this one was submitted as 2 tubes. Clearly there's 3. Does that mean there's a tube from somebody else? Does that mean that there's most likely 3 tubes in there and somebody just typed 2 in? How am I supposed to know as the lab? How's anybody else supposed to know in the rest of the system? Despite all that instruction and everything else, we see ones like this. The seal's not there, so now I've got 3 tubes in a box. Those tubes have no label on them. So a little Navy story. When I was in the Navy going through officer candidacy school, they had 700 of us lined up down the hall, because it's the Navy, this is what you do. And we were supposed to be getting samples taken for our DNA records, so that, you know, when they find a tooth of us at the bottom of the ocean, they can, you know, put it back to the right person. So a little orderly came down the hall handing out the little glass fiber cards and a pencil that you were supposed to write your name on the card. Okay, good. Then by the time he got up to the front of the line, there was a corpsman sitting there taking blood into 2 4-milliliter purple top tubes and then rubber banding those unlabeled to the card and putting them in a shoebox. I am pretty certain my DNA is associated with somebody named Martha. That doesn't work. This label has to be on the sample. So the other issue is, that's toxicology. That's one kind of evidence. This is an issue across all laboratories, across the whole country. This isn't just simply one agency. This isn't just simply people being lazy and apathetic. This is a complex thing of how do you try and collect evidence in complex circumstances reliably. It's not easy. But all labs see things like this. Please run this for DNA and latent prints. Okay, there's DNA and latent prints on there. They're yours. I'm not going to spend $3,000 figuring that out because you just handed it to me barehanded. We see this all the time. All laboratories see this all the time. Please give me latent prints off of this, and it's been stored outside. Okay, there's prints on it. They're of no use whatsoever. We see this all the time. Again, this isn't a single agency. This is repeated and constant throughout the nation. And this last one is particularly challenging. So, an evidence seal, a sufficient evidence seal. There are no statutory requirements around what a sufficient evidence seal is. But a sufficient evidence seal is typically viewed as a piece of evidence tape, so Tapper evident tape that then has both initials and a date written across it and the packaging. So on the left-hand side, right-hand side, we have a correct evidence seal. On the other end of that package, I don't. If I were to reject evidence that came to us that looked like this, we would reject nearly everything that came to our borders. At a 50% rejection rate, that was catastrophic to the system. So it's not responsible for me to simply be belligerent and reject that, but strictly speaking, that is not a properly packaged piece of evidence. How do we work past that? So, just setting up some of the challenges. I would estimate, and this is anecdotal, across the nation, what we see, significant errors, probably somewhere in the 10 to 20% range. That's huge. If I were to include improper seals, we're talking 75, 90% of all evidence. So how do we get to something less than 1%? Basically, it's got to go through an effort of redesigning packaging for everything. It's got to be made so that it is easy for officers in the field to actually be able to do this. They have an impossible job in the field. They can't be writing a name down 6 times. They can't be dealing with stuff. It's got to be designed to be usable in the field. Tracking systems. It's great we're getting this for sexual assault kits, but how about all the crimes that affect everybody else? Training, 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 and yes, more training. But keep in mind, we can't train our way out of this hole. And the feedback back to the person that's made the error has got to be quick. It's like dealing with the kids. Not to say that the people doing this are the kids, but that it's the feedback and the speed of the feedback that changes behaviors. It's not the severity of the punishment for it, it's the speed of the feedback. If we're really going to change it, we've got to be able to tell people they made this error as quickly as possible at the point they made the error. So I can rant about this all day. We've got other great speakers here. I will let them cover their various aspects, but I just kind of wanted to set up kind of the national picture of challenges that we face. And it seems like most laboratory people I talk with, they all nod their heads on those evidence seals. I'm hoping Las Vegas is doing a little bit better than that, but it's the same. Oh, great. All right, so we've got Steve is up next. So Steve is with International Association of Property and Evidence. And I've got yours up there. Yeah. Just for disclosure's sake, I guess, our property handling within HFSC is accredited under IAPE.
Well, thank you. I don't know if you're going to have the same applause at the end, but I hope so. All right. I set the record for the longest title for a presentation. I know that. Right there. Perfect. Thank you, Peter. What Peter said, what Dr. Stout said, is kind of astounding to me in terms of some of the stats. But again, it shouldn't be. It really shouldn't be. My background is law enforcement. I was a sworn officer for about 28 years, and I've been teaching in the area of evidence management for about 25 of those. Since I retired, it's almost a full-time job, and yes, I do the accreditation, but I also do the teaching. What we're going to cover is basically how we work together and how we don't work together. I'll show you some of the negatives, but I'm going to hopefully show you some of how we fix these things. What we just heard about the evidence labeling, you're going to see some of those things in here. You're going to see some of the issues of working in silos, working as a PD, working as a lab, working as defense attorneys, district attorneys, and not working together in the courts. It just drives us crazy. All right. Oops. Let me go back. Right there. That's good.
Can I blame Ramit for this?
It's probably operator error on my side.
All right, try that again there.
All right. There we are. There's a couple of terms that I'll use in here, and you'll say, why are you using that? First one is we have the gold. When I go into law enforcement agencies and the cop shops, they'll say, and we'll ask them, Chief, Captain, Lieutenant, how are we operating? How's it going? Well, it's doing pretty good. You know, they put the stuff on the shelf, and when we need it, it's usually there. Well, Chief, they do more than that, I hope. And I hope they find it when you ask for it. We think your evidence units have the gold. The labs have the gold. And I say that, and they kind of look at me funny, and I said, I'm not talking the jewelry, and I'm not talking the money that's in the safe. You have the evidence that's going to prosecute, acquit, or exonerate people. Is there anything more valuable in your organization? They kind of look at me and they said, Steve, we're busy with all these other things. I said, we have the gold. The people that work in our evidence rooms, that work in our labs, that work in all of this criminal justice system with evidence, they're key components in how we do our business. Do we manage these items in the best interest of criminal justice, period? Getting out of that silo. What does our community think about us? Usually when I get a call, it's usually because there's an issue, just not for accreditation, because that's when they've reached that pinnacle. But sometimes I get called, and I just got back from an agency where they've lost homicide evidence. How does that community look at that? That's the type of thing where we mislabel the tubes, where we mislabel the evidence, and now we've lost it. That credibility is lost. Do we ever admit our mistakes? Do we ever come up, just like we just talked about, do we admit our mistakes, and how do we fix those mistakes? How do we come back in a forum like this and said, we screwed up here, but here's what we've done to correct it. And here's the partners that we've all worked with to get this correction made. There's a silos. And this is perfect. When Peter, Dr. Stout talks about the stuff that comes in, if we have garbage coming in, it's garbage going out. How much time do we spend on evidence training when it comes to the academy, when it comes to post-academy, long-term education for educating the officers, our judges, our forensic people, our prosecutors, and our defense? Do we do a good job of that? That's a problem, and if anybody in this room doesn't see that as a problem, talk to me afterwards. When I walked into this room and I'm looking at this stuff, and what do you think's in those red bags? That stuff dripping on me as I'm going underneath there, and I'm going, yeah, that's the attempt murder, that's et cetera, et cetera. Those are the issues that we see, and we say we can't have that. When was the last time the chief, the sheriff, the captain was in that room to actually see that issue? This doesn't look too bad because it's not in a red bag. So what is it? Here's where we work together. It's a misdemeanor case, and we know we're talking about with misdemeanors. Most of the stuff in our evidence room is misdemeanor evidence, low-lying, low-level fruit. Here's a case where we had a shoplift out of a Target store, whatever. This individual was arrested on a Friday, spent time in custody Saturday and Sunday, and on Monday, guess what happened? Case disposed. Time served, life is good. You happy with that? Sign here, and we're done. The evidence in this misdemeanor sat on the shelf for 7 years. Now, how could have that been fixed? Could the attorney, the prosecutor, notified us that the case has been resolved? Could the investigator have done the same thing? The investigator's looking at one thing, the DA's looking at another thing, and we in the property room are looking at something else. That's the silo effect that I'm talking about. How could we fix this? Well, you say, well, that's not too bad, Steve. That's just one part of the shelf. I want to protect the gold that we have in our evidence rooms, and to do that, I've got to reduce the inventory. And reducing the inventory means I don't bring in everything that looks good, but I have an education on what I should be bringing in. Going back to what Dr. Stout said, how I protect that evidence from the time I bring it in to the time we present it in court, to the time we take it to the lab, etc. I don't need to manage this stuff on this shelf. We go into the PD and I said, all right, let's take a look at the processes, because that's what we do. Well, here's a process. Minor in possession. I'm on a college campus right now, right? How many do you get? Minor in possession. So the agency was sending the alcohol into the lab for processing to make sure it's alcohol. We said, well, okay, that's your issue. How long does it take to get the alcohol results back? Oh, good, Steve, about 90 days. What is the normal process for a MIP, minor in possession? Maybe you cite them out, maybe you give them a fine. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm taking up critical analyst time to say, smells like a Budweiser, I bet it is. Now again, I'm not making too light of this, but I'm saying, is this an issue where we don't think through the process? Our analysts should be doing things other than that, not spending their time. And if we start thinking a little bit differently, maybe we see some of these processes that we can fix so we don't waste our time. When we see a property room like this, and this is directly over the courthouse, the court is hearing sessions right now underneath this poor gentleman's room. This is what he's having to deal with. Extreme? Yeah, maybe so. But what I'm saying is, are we putting the resources into the evidence room and into the other aspects of this criminal justice system? If our communities knew this, and they did, this came out of the Denver Post, did a huge article on issues with evidence across the country. This was not in Colorado. Here's the results. When we don't do things right, you're going to pay for it now or you're going to pay for it later. If we have the gold, can we get rid of some of the minor cases? Can we get rid of some of these low-level items so we can better manage our stuff? When the agencies get so overrun with property and evidence, it takes years to get back on track. And I don't identify which agency is which, because that's not right. But what we're saying is, to get caught up, this one agency at the top, it would take 6 detectives, 7 months, or about 3.5 years of man-hours to get caught up. Keep on going down that list, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. It's either pay me now and do it right and stay on track, or this is what you're going to get. Those detectives, crimes against persons, crimes against property, they're all out of their realm to have to work on the evidence. That's not what we want. Taking time to examine how we're doing business. And you're going to say, Steve, this is a little naive. Well, it's kind of hard to be naive after 28 years in this business. But I'm going to tell you a few things that I think might help us. We're all too busy rather than thinking forward for efficiency and cost-effective measures. We talked about that earlier. Have we ever thought about a one-day shot at actually working together and say, what does it take for the DA's office to get back to us with information? What do we at the PD, in the evidence room, the evidence unit, the detective bureau, need to do to work better with them? And with the court. What does the court clerk need from us, and what do we need from them? Do they understand our processes and our procedures? If I had a one-day deal, I would love to see that happen, where you get the chief court clerk, the prosecutor, the PD, all together and saying, here's what we do. What can we do to make it better for you, getting out of the silos? The last one on there. Now you really think I'm crazy. The Chick-fil-A moment. What the heck are you into Chick-fil-A sandwiches? I go in there and I tell folks, if you have a problem with a prosecutor, if we have a problem in the evidence room, have we ever taken the moment to bring them down to actually look at what we've got sitting in our property rooms? Could you have that sandwich waiting for them with a cup of coffee and say, give me an hour and a half and I want to show you the problem? When you say retain, retain, retain for possible prosecution down the road, this is what I've got, all of this stuff. And if I'm holding this stuff just in case, I can't manage the gold, my sexual assault, my homicide, etc., etc. Bring them in, pay for the lunch, maybe do it every year or 2 years, but tell them what the issues are, and you say, I'm going to open up, what can I do to do a better job for you? All right. A shared software system that actually I can go ahead as a DA, I can look at the evidence that's been brought in. Digital evidence. Most in this room understand the digital evidence issues. DAs want to see the evidence, the body camera, the car camera, the video from the investigation room. I get that. But when we get the request for all of those items of digital evidence on a case for driving without a driver's license, what are we doing? We're tying up our time at the PD when maybe we should be thinking a little differently and prosecuting some of the low-lying cases without some of the things that take a huge amount of our time. I'm kind of throwing some things out there. You say, well, wait a minute. We're trying to work together, getting out of the silos, thinking differently, and how we can work together, and understanding each job that all of us have to do. With that, there's my phone number. There's my email. Contact me. Be glad to talk to you more. It's not about trying to go out and get more work. We always seem to find enough work. It's always out there. We just want to make sure that evidence rises to that same level of activity for us in law enforcement. Use of force cases, jail deaths, all of the high-level stuff. Because we have the gold. And if we don't do the right thing with the gold that we have on the intake, all the way through the system, we're short-circuiting what really the criminal justice system is about and what our communities expect of us. So, anyhow, thank you. And I hope that makes sense to you.
All right, Melissa Huffmaster with Las Vegas. Let me make sure I try and get this to work better for you this time.
Just use the arrows.
Yeah, you could just use the arrows. So, there you go. Okay, one thumb. I think it's in the projector.
Okay. All right. And I just... Good morning. My name is Melissa Huffmaster. I'm the director of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Evidence Vault, also known as Property and Evidence Rooms. Throughout the conversation, I will be saying Evidence Vault. It's just too many years to change. All right, so real quick about myself. I've been the director for the last 7 years. I was an evidence supervisor prior to that. I hired into the Metro as an evidence technician 18 years ago. I've also worked as a clinical laboratory scientist, medical technologist, and a clinical in a private physician's laboratory. And for about 3 years, I have a degree in clinical laboratory sciences and a minor in chemistry. So my whole goal was to transfer over to the forensic laboratory at some point, but I stuck with the evidence vault after all these years, even when the opportunity presented itself. So another real quick, just so you know the demographics of what we deal with. We receive about 3,800 items a week, and we transfer about 16% of that evidence over to the forensic laboratory. We transfer about 400 items over to the lab. Actually, what I should back up, it's not 16% that we transfer, 16% of what we receive goes through the forensic laboratory. So that's about 400 packages that we transfer on any given day or week, and about 620 that's returned from the forensic laboratory. I have a little about 1 million items in inventory right now. I've reduced that about 12% so far. We're working on what Steve was talking about, trying to reduce your inventory. Let's see. Might not be able to do that.
No, it's just being obnoxious. Hang on.
So my goal here today is to share with you what we do at the Evidence Vault to collaborate with the Forensic Laboratory. And I'd be remiss if I didn't share with you what the Forensic Lab does and also the crime scene investigations. We all work in the same bureau together. And there's also some influence over this success of our collaboration because of our organizational structure. Right now, we are situated in the Investigative Services Division. This is similar to the I always forget this, similar to the Houston PD Criminal and Special Investigations Commands. This is where you're going to find Homicide, Sex Crimes Bureau, Major Violators, Narcotics Crimes Bureau, Theft Crimes Bureau, Gang Vice Bureau. So we're the Criminalistics Bureau. Again, that's the Evidence Vault, Forensic Laboratory, and Crime Scene Investigations. I know there is some debate out there over this organizational structure about the biases, the undue influence that it can have over forensic laboratories, and believe it or not, over evidence and property rooms as well. We don't experience that. I believe that has to do with our command structure. We have a captain that oversees, no, I went too far. We have a captain, which is our Criminalistics Bureau commander. And he does a lot of work for us, and he probably buffers most of the undue bias or the personal agendas that they want to impart onto forensic laboratories and evidence and property rooms. So he does a lot of collaboration for us. I'm having serious issues here. This must be a touch screen. That's why. My apology. All right, so our commander, he participates in the daily crime briefs and the weekly planning meetings. These are the weekly meetings where all the patrol commands, patrol regions get together and they discuss the crimes that they're fighting. They're discussing suspects that they're trying to build. And he's in there listening to what's going on. He's reaching out to the Evidence Vault. He's asking me, hey, do you have this evidence? Has it been dropped yet? Can you get it entered into the system? Perhaps he's hearing conversation about search warrants that need to be obtained in order to collect buccal swabs, and he's like, wait, we might have that evidence. We might have a buccal swab for that suspect that you're interested in. And he'll go into our evidence inventory management system and he'll look for that, and typically he'll find the buccal swabs. So this really just helps move the evidence and cases through the system for much quicker prosecution. And this facilitates collaboration and unity. That's where he's talking to the sergeants, lieutenants, he's talking to the detectives. He's asking and having conversations to help them identify the most probative evidence. What's of value? What do they have? What do they have before them? What are they trying to get from the evidence for their investigation? And then he's taken a look at our productivity between the three sections within our bureau. Do we have any single points of failure? Do we have bottlenecks in order to move, again, this evidence through? We're moving towards real-time analysis, and so identifying these bottlenecks and any points of failure are really key to help us with this. So for the crime scene investigations and their collaborative efforts, they have a crime scene investigator analyst. And this analyst is watching the daily watch commander logs. Those are logs where the lieutenants are overseeing the entire valley and that particular shift, and they're building a log of more significant events. This analyst is watching those logs. They're trying to identify what are the predominant cases. They're also in tune with what cases are, or what crime scenes are being worked by their crime scene investigators. Those are the people that go out and collect the evidence for these more violent crimes. And so they know what's going on out there, and they're trying to help identify and prioritize evidence for processing. The crime scene investigators, they're swabbing some DNA. They swab guns, and they're processing latent prints. And then our crime scene investigators, they set aside evidence in what we call a forensic hold. It's just a concept where they're setting evidence aside that they know needs to go through the forensic laboratory in a much quicker manner. And so this evidence is set in the forensic hold. The forensic laboratory has 3 evidence technologists or evidence technicians, and these technicians are not under my purview, but they have been interviewed and transferred from my section, and they work in the forensic laboratory. So these evidence technicians will go over to crime scene investigations and collect the evidence in the forensic hold, and they get that stuff data entered. So for the evidence vault in our what we do, these are just little things. There's nothing here that's of big magnitude. They're just all little things that are like pieces of the puzzle to build the bigger picture of what goes on. So we enforced impound standards. About 12 years ago, we had over 300 and something officers that needed to respond in any given day to fix evidence impound errors, which Dr. Stout was talking about. Definitely a big issue. We were doing a phenomenal job of policing the police. And so what we had to do is sit down with the forensic laboratory, and we had some investigators and other members of the organization, and we talked about what we were doing and what did our impound standards look like, and how were we enforcing those, and what could we do differently? What could the forensic lab get by with? Could we, an evidence seals, do we have to write errors on evidence seals that don't cover the entire seam of the envelope? Or can we get by with it if it's almost a quarter inch on each end, if it's properly signed? Are the evidence seals signed and dated? Is the package label signed? Right? Some of the basic core information, do you have that? And so we had those conversations to see what we could and could not enforce. We have about 10 officers now on any given day that need to respond to fix impound errors. The other thing that we did with this, which was huge to facilitate the movement of evidence between the evidence vault and the forensic laboratory, is that if we can see it, we can fix it in some respects. So for example, if we can see that the incident, or what we call an event number, there's an error between package, maybe the inventory management system, and reports, we can validate that number easily enough ourselves, and we're going to fix that. We'll sign it, initial it, and make all those corrections. We use SharePoint to do automated notifications. So we enter a notification in saying, hey, officer, you made an error on your incident number, and this notification goes out to the officer so he knows to fix any associated reports on his end. It also hits the jail and records. So everybody knows that this error was made and it's fixed in a much more quick manner. The other thing we do is firearms. So we use plastic bags to impound our firearms. We have no humidity. It's very dry there. So the bags don't matter for us. And this is just something new that we moved into because we were having so many errors with firearms and the information. Because just because you're a police officer doesn't mean that you know the difference between some model numbers and serial numbers, right? There's a lot of issues with firearm information that's being documented. So through these bags, we can verify make, model, serial number, and if we can see this information, we're going to fix it. We're going to make sure that the information that's entered into our evidence inventory management system is accurate. Garbage in, garbage out. Garbage in, you can't find it, can't get data, you can't get stats, so we're going to get all this stuff as accurate as we possibly can. Then we prioritize data entry. So our crime scene investigation impounds, I already mentioned the forensic hold that's taken care of by the forensic laboratory evidence technicians, but the evidence vault, we go pick up evidence. And so when we get the crime scene investigations evidence back to our facility, that's the first thing that we data enter, because that's probably the highest, has the highest likelihood of going to the forensic laboratory. So we need to get that stuff entered into the system first. Cartridge cases and fired shot shells. We have a program within our organization that's called ShotSpotter. Just real quick, it's an acoustics program where shots are fired, communications is notified, communications dispatches patrol, patrol goes out, they collect the cart cases. They're getting these cart cases and they're letting us know if they're a part of the ShotSpotter program, and regardless if they are or not, the cart cases and fired shot shells are entered into our system automatically, and they're also auto-routed to the forensic laboratory. We're not waiting for forensic requests on this stuff because the firearms detail is into real-time analysis. They have no backlog. And the next thing that we're doing is data entering the oldest date first. So after crime scene investigations, cart cases, then it's everything else based on the oldest date. All right, let me see. This was not supposed, all right. So the data entry criteria. This is something that we've worked a lot on with the forensic laboratory over the years. Different ideas have popped up and that we've followed suit. So we're entering into our system whether items are latent print processed or DNA processed. This allows the forensic scientists to see this information readily, so they know what has been processed with the items at hand. Latent prints, are there CDs? Are there photos? Are there exemplars? If there are, we're putting all this information in a certain format. Buccal swab kits. We put this information in, last name, first name, no middle initial. Why? So it can easily be researched, so the information can be pulled from our system quickly. So we're using a very specific format. And same with all this other specialized collection kits. And then we recently started entering all the swabs that were collected on the assay kits. Again, this will allow the scientists to see what evidence that they have before they pull the kit over to the lab and open it up. They can see right away. So this is an example of what we have for a barcode on our latent prints, 3 lifts, photos, and exemplars. It doesn't always look like this, but this is one that has all those items. The DNA buccal swab kit, had to redact the name, but that gives you an idea. And it also says that it's a voluntary. This is something else that we do because I need to know whether the buccal swabs are voluntary so I can purge them from my inventory. Sexual assault kits, and then an example of how it looks with all the different swabs. All right, so the last thing is the cartridge cases, and that goes back to the ShotSpotter program. And that's for both the firearms detail at the forensic laboratory. They want to know if it's just, collected from the ShotSpotter program, and for our crime analysts for data analysis for the organization. Some more collaborative efforts. Scientists requesting evidence. They don't need to submit any paper requests. They go straight into our evidence management system and they build lists of the evidence that they need from us. Investigators, we have a SharePoint program. They can go in, enter their request. That tells us that evidence needs to be entered immediately. And then once we enter it, we indicate in SharePoint that it's done. It sends an automated notification to the officer to say, hey, the stuff is entered. Now you can submit your electronic request. We are not yet at the point where officers enter information into our system like a shell entry. But once we get there, that will help. But we do now have a 3-day data entry turnaround time. So the investigators usually use the SharePoint program more as a tickler. They work weekends, we don't, so they put this stuff into SharePoint, and then we're giving them the notification, hey, you can go ahead and submit your request. Delivery of evidence. We have worked with the forensic laboratory. They want the evidence to be delivered at 7 o'clock every morning. This is something that we've been doing for as many years as I've worked there. But we've committed to that time, and they've committed to making sure that they're asking for their evidence in a timely manner as well. And they have cutoffs as well, so we can get this evidence all pulled. Like I said, it's a lot of evidence that we're pulling over there, moving every day. So we also auto-route, I mentioned the cart cases, and we auto-route semi-automatic handguns. This is all to facilitate the real-time analysis of these items. So for the forensic laboratory and the things that they do, they have the 3 evidence technicians. Those technicians pick up evidence from all the hospitals. They pick up all the assay kits, all the blood alcohol kits, and they don't have a backlog. They get that stuff data entered immediately so it can move through the forensic laboratory. And then the data entry of the crime scene investigations, I already mentioned that. They're picking up the evidence from the forensic hold. They're dealing with their own missing items. So again, these are impound errors. They open a package up, there's stuff that's missing. Do we need to file a statement of complaint, or is this something that we can fix? And we've evaluated that. If it's just a piece of clothing or something little, they might be able to manage that themselves, and they do. They don't send it back to us. They make the adjustments in the evidence inventory management system. They're indicating in their case notes, and we move on. It's a done deal. We're not asking for officers to come fix that. And then they file their own statement of complaints if something like drug items is missing or something of value, obviously a secure item that should be there. They used to try and send that stuff back to us, and we're like, All right, so other jurisdiction evidence. Our forensic laboratory serves all of Southern Nevada. They have contracts with all the other jurisdictions to do forensic analysis for them. So we would, at the evidence vault, accept about 400 packages in a week from other jurisdictions, and we were the middlemen. And I think that there was a lot of bottlenecking with this process. So the forensic laboratory just recently took on the other jurisdictions, so they'll be able to have these conversations with the OJs about what type of evidence is being submitted and probably reduce the number of impounds that they're receiving. And then the forensic laboratory is managing their own evidence for outsourced analysis. They could easily put that on us, but they don't. They manage it. They send all their sexual assault kits that are contracted out. They're doing all that shipping. We do accept the assay kits that are shipped back because there's usually about 100 at a time, and we want to minimize the handling of these kits to ensure they're not lost and they're entered back into our system immediately. But then we send all the information over to the forensic laboratory so they can manage and track their own evidence. And some other things that I just would like to point out that are more recent for collaborative efforts is policy. We work a lot together on policy language. And one of the things that we did recently for the forensic lab is we produced training on how to impound firearms and how to preserve DNA evidence. And you ask, well, why the evidence vault? Why are you making those videos? Well, again, we all work in one bureau, and we are the impound experts and they are the scientists, and so we had them give us all the information. We put the video together and it's a mandatory training. It's been very successful because we do have a lot of issues with cross-contamination on firearms. And so that's most of the collaborative efforts that we have. A lot of them have been over the last, I'd say, 3 to 4 years. A lot of them are from ideas. Hey, what about this? I can't get that done. But some of them have resulted because of annoyances between the 3 sections. Then we work together and meet in the middle on what's most efficient for all the sections at hand. And that's it. Thank you.
That's not yours. All right. Gerald, you didn't have any slides, right? You didn't have any slides? You didn't have any presentation. Okay. So next up is Gerald Doyle with Harris County District Attorney's Office. Let me put something here. There it is. Mouse is difficult.
Good morning. My name is Gerald Doyle. I'm with the Harris County District Attorney's Office. I'm with the Conviction Integrity Division. I want to give a shout out to Randy Capone, who's the other Assistant District Attorney who works with me in the Conviction Integrity Division. The role of the Conviction Integrity Division really is to make sure we got the right person. It's a search for truth, and as part of that search for truth, we're looking for property. We're looking for property to test so that we can use that property and the forensic analysis from that property to tell the story, to find out exactly what happened in the commission of that crime. Most of our cases are cold cases, they're old cases. Witnesses may have died, memories may have faded, so that's why we rely on the property. Let me just say, I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm a dinosaur. I'm a paper guy. My background, I was 27 years with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Houston. I retired from that position to take the position with the Conviction Integrity Division. Two preliminary remarks. First of all, I am here in my individual capacity. I'm not here when I will talk about proposed solutions. That's not a policy statement from the Harris County District Attorney's Office, but it's what I have observed and some solutions that I might suggest. And then secondly, I'm here to talk about challenges we've faced in the over 2 years that I've been with the office, and those challenges are going to address particular cases. I'm not here to point blame or finger on anyone. We all handle evidence. Prosecutors handle evidence, and we can tell you we have reviewed state's files where we will find in that state's file evidence that the prosecutor put in that file instead of having returned it to the property room. It's a system-wide issue that we have with handling evidence. We deal with, on a day-to-day basis, some tremendously dedicated professionals in our property rooms across this county. So my remarks on the challenges that we face are not really to point blame at people, but with an approach of there are things we can do that we can improve upon. So challenges in the two and a half years that I've been in this position, we've had a few. So let me give you an example. There was a case that we're looking at with the Innocence Project in New York. The victim was shot in his apartment. The suspect flees, drops the firearm, a handgun, as he's fleeing. There is no other evidence to test, but that handgun was retrieved, and this is years ago. So we're looking for that handgun to see if we can get touch DNA on that. So what we do is we go to the property room of the investigating agency, and good, they've still got the handgun. So we send it off to the lab to get it tested. Terrific. We now have a DNA profile of a major contributor on that handgun. Who's the major contributor? It was the property room employee who retrieved the handgun for us. Disappointing. And a dead end for us in many ways in this investigation. This investigation identity is very much an issue. That handgun was a critical piece of evidence. And again, the major DNA contributor on the exterior gun grip and the magazine was a property room employee who retrieved it. Second case, defendant was convicted of stabbing a spouse multiple times. Spouse died in the residence. We're looking at that case. Some critical pieces of evidence in that case are a towel in the bathroom, because that was very close to the crime scene. Also, a piece of clothing that appears to have been worn by the suspect and left at the scene. So we go to the property room to look at that evidence. And out comes the evidence of the towel. It's wrapped in a brown bag, sealed appropriately. Everything's by the book. Property room custodian opens up the bag for us, and the towel is completely mildewed. No good for us. We were hoping to be able to test it for trace evidence, and we've lost a critical piece of evidence that could help us in determining who actually committed that crime. So what about the clothing? Property room custodian of the law enforcement agency investigating the case doesn't have it. District clerk's office doesn't have it, and they're the custodians of trial exhibits. No one seems to have this critical piece of clothing that the suspect left at the scene. So the hunt continues. We contact the court reporter. The defendant was sentenced in August of 2017. In January of 2019, when we contact the court reporter had that piece of clothing. Now, how that piece of clothing was maintained in over a year and a half, how it was handled, whether that's been compromised for testing, are all issues that we face. So again, evidence handling is system-wide across our entire criminal justice system. Another case, now this is a case with the public defender's office. Victim was killed on shot lying in his bed. So there's a comforter, obviously, under the victim at the time he was shot. The defendant has been convicted and was wearing a nightgown. There's a spot of blood on the nightgown that was testified to at trial. A couple things. We're interested in that comforter. We're interested, is there some trace evidence there that we could test? Is there bloodstain analysis that could be done that could perhaps shed some light on this case? The offense report says that the comforter was picked up that day at the crime scene by the crime scene investigators. Property room has no evidence, no record of that comforter ever having been turned into the property room. To this day, we don't know what happened to the comforter that the victim was lying on when he was shot. So how about the nightgown? So the nightgown, there were multiple spots on it. One spot, though, testified at trial was a spot of blood, determined to be blood. It's very important. It was never tested at the time for DNA. It would be very important to know if the defendant's nightgown, that spot of blood, was the victim's blood, that the DNA comes back to the victim. That would certainly put the defendant right there at the scene. So we want to test that blood spot for DNA. So we go to the lab that tested that initially, and they are very clear about what happened to it. They have the chain of custody. They put that cutting with the blood spot in a vial, put it in an envelope, sealed the envelope, put it in another package, sealed that package, and according to the chain of custody, gave it to the law enforcement agency. Well, we have found that the law enforcement agency has the package. What we found was the envelope in which the vial was put. We've never found the vial. What the explanation is, or why the vial might have been separated from the envelope, we don't have that explanation. We don't know what happened to that vial. A critical piece of evidence for us to confirm that we got the right person, or to perhaps suggest that there may be other facts that we need to look at and investigate as to who committed the crime. Another case, one working with the DNA mixture review. This was a recent case that we had. So DNA mixture review is a project that's going on, and Bob Wyckoff with the Public Defender's Office is leading that statewide. And they're re-looking at cases where DNA was analyzed to see if it goes into CPI and issues that I'm not going to go into, but there's a need to recalculate. There's a need to relook at some of this evidence. It's a sexual assault kit, a sexual assault case. And so we want to test the panties of the victim in the sexual assault case. So we go to the property room of the investigating agency and say, please send us a list of the property that you have in your property room, because we're hoping the panties are there so we can send it on to the lab for retesting. And we get a list, and it's a cell phone, it's a cord, and it's buccal swabs from the defendant. Well, it's a sexual assault case. Looking at the offense report, there was a sexual assault kit done. Panties were picked up as well. So we go back to the lab and we say, okay, you tested these items. Do you still have them? What happened to them? Well, they provide us a chain of custody form. And the chain of custody form indicates that in 2011, they gave the panties and the sexual assault kit back to the law enforcement officer with the agency that was investigating this crime. So we go back now to that same agency and we say, okay, looks like you had it, or an officer had it in 2011. What happened to that? Turns out they did have it, which is good news. It's in the property room. Well, how did it not get on the list to begin with? Because frankly, we could have, and we don't, but we could have ended the search there. You know, I'm sorry, the panties and sexual assault kit aren't there. The property room doesn't have them. But it's like a scavenger hunt. You just keep asking questions till you get the answers. And what happened is, and I read from it, when they initially got the call on the case, they assigned a particular case number to it. And as the investigation continued, they decided to investigate it as it was, a sexual assault. They assigned a different case number to it. So the sexual assault kit and the panties were under one case number. The cell phone, the cord, and the buccal swabs were in another case number, not cross-referenced. So again, we're grateful that it was in the property room. There's ways to improve the system so that when we ask that first time, what do you have in connection with this case, we're going to get the entire list of property. And then another case, and then the last one. Let me just say, property descriptions are huge to us. In Chapter 64 was what under the Code of Criminal Procedure, that's the procedure whereby you can do post-conviction DNA testing of evidence that has a reasonable likelihood of containing biological material. And we handle those at our Conviction Integrity Division. So we're always looking to our property custodians to provide us a list of what they've got to determine if some evidence that they have has a reasonable likelihood, that's a phone call, has a reasonable likelihood of containing biological material. So property descriptions are key to us because we don't want the property custodians to have to go look into each of these envelopes and reseal them and possibly compromise the evidence. So here's a description that, or an explanation we got from an employee of a property room, and it's very candid and very helpful. Quote, "The problem with our evidence tracking system is it allows the individual that creates the evidence tag to title the tag whatever he or she wants. Whatever is put on the tag is what is titled in the system. For example, a bloody shirt from autopsy could be titled, quote, autopsy evidence. This evidence should be titled bloody shirt from autopsy." So that's critical to us. Bloody shirt from autopsy tells us, the defense attorney and the court, there's a piece of evidence here that has biological material that could be tested for purposes of Chapter 64. So just, those are a sample of some of the challenges that we've encountered in our work. So suggested solutions, and I've got just 5 I want to touch on. First of all, I think we could really look in our county for consolidation of property rooms. We've seen it already with some. I think Precinct 4 has been coordinating with the Sheriff's Office to maintain some of their property. We've got about 80 plus law enforcement agencies across this county, and I think we would do well to consider perhaps consolidating some of those property rooms. I think it would help a lot in reducing the error rate, coming up with a system so that everyone uses and is beneficial to everyone. Secondly, we need to ensure that our property rooms aren't subject to natural disasters. Another thing we do in Conviction Integrity Division is we send out mass notifications to defendants and defendants' attorneys on property that's been compromised. So Hurricane Harvey taught us a lesson. There were a number of property rooms, a couple property rooms in particular, where evidence flooded. That should not happen. We should not have to send out those notices to defendants and defendants' attorneys saying, you know, sorry about the property, but it's no good anymore, it got flooded. Third, I think we really need to regularly bring our city and county property room employees together for training, and I know Peter talked about that. We have a lot of best practices in this county. We've got a lot of professionals who are very conscientious about their property rooms and maintaining that property the right way. And we do not have uniform standards across this county. And I think we can learn a lot from each other. And I would really welcome a forum where we could bring people together on that issue and share best practices and come up with solutions county-wide that we could implement. Fourth, let's make sure that the property employees in our property rooms are trained on handling evidence. And let's make sure that they handle the evidence. Let me give you two examples. We went to one property room, and they had property, how am I doing time? Property room, and it was great. We sat down, there was a table there, brown paper put out, and the person, the property room custodian, brought the evidence out, had the gloves on, handled the evidence, unpackaged it, everything like this. This was the one with the mildewed towel. But it was clear that that was the way that property room handled it, that it was only the property custodians who handled the property. Went to another property room to view evidence, and the property custodian was great, brought us the evidence, but then positioned themselves in a chair, observing us handle the evidence. And there were gloves there, and there was brown paper that we put down on the table. Makes me a little uncomfortable. And you know, the gloves were there, the paper was there, and everything like that. But I'm thinking, who else may have handled this evidence? Did they use gloves? Did they put the paper down? Did they possibly compromise it in some way? And I would just prefer that our property room custodians be the only ones that handle that evidence. And then lastly, I really think we can learn from our next speaker. Rebecca View of DPS has come up with a great statewide automated tracking system for sexual assault kits. I really wish that we would, in our county, have an automated, uniform tracking system. So that one law enforcement agency, if they're looking for property because it's a related crime, it's not going to go through reading hieroglyphics from the other agency and how they maintain it and their various tracking system. I think that would help us to coordinate better our efforts to get to the truth and to solve crimes. So in closing, I just want to say thank you to the Houston Forensic Science Center for this symposium. Evidence handling and how we go about preserving and storing that evidence is so critical to the work that all of us do in this criminal justice system, from the defense bar to the court to the prosecutors, the investigators, all of us, to get to the truth, and we can't emphasize it enough. So thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. Let's see. This way. There.
Good morning. My name is Rebecca V. I'm with the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory Service, and I'm actually based out of our main lab in Austin, Texas. Prior to working with the Sexual Assault Evidence Tracking Program For Texas, I was the CODIS liaison for the state database here in Texas. So a little bit of what's already been talked about. It hits home for me both from the CODIS perspective and now for sexual assault evidence tracking. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the legislation, but it's important for us to note here in the room, in 2017, the legislation passed. They gave us about 2 years to develop and implement the statewide electronic tracking system for the sexual assault kits. Why do we have a tracking system? Because of the issues that have been brought up here today. And if you followed sexual assault kit legislation across the country, you know a lot of that started in Michigan. And it was based off of how we were and were not properly handling sexual assault evidence. We know that in Michigan, their sexual assault kits were being housed in literally dilapidated warehouses. They didn't even have windows. They have footage of pigeons flying in and out where these sexual assault kits were stored. Homeless people were living amongst sexual assault kits, right? So there were fundamental issues that, you know, hindsight we look at and we're like, how did that ever happen? But that's really kind of what has gotten us to where we're at here today, especially when we look at why we're tracking sexual assault kits. As I said, it passed in 2017. It required DPS to develop and implement the system. It requires participation by all of those involved in the collection, investigation, and prosecution of sexual assault offenses. So that's everyone from the SANE or doctor who may collect the evidence to your law enforcement agency, the crime lab, and the prosecutor. Most importantly, to the bill's author, it allows the survivor to be able to anonymously track their evidence. Okay? So the anonymous key point of that, I'll bring up here again in a minute because it does become a challenge as well. We've already talked about who's required to participate. Obviously, survivors are not required to, but they have the option. We, over the summer, we kicked off a pilot project in 5 locations around the state. Houston was one of those locations, and we'll talk about how that was significant for us here in a little bit. We had 2 options with the state when we were at DPS charged with implementing the system. Is we could try to build it in-house, or we could look for an off-the-shelf product that was already on the market. Because of how the wheels of purchasing go within the state, we knew that we didn't have enough time to try to develop it in-house. And so we looked for an off-the-shelf product that existed. We did a request for offer. We put it out on the national market, and we ended up with a product that's called Track It. It's a Canadian-based company called Stax DNA. They also provide software for DNA labs. They also had, at the time when they got Texas, they were already working with Washington State and Michigan. Since then, they've added the states of Arizona, Nevada, Massachusetts, and I believe they just got another contract with another state. That's important just because of like what we're doing here today. It's about collaboration, right? And so for me, when we started this and I knew that I could reach out to Washington State and Michigan and learn from some of what they had done good and what they had done not so good, that was important. And so we continue to do that and we collaborate together. Each user group has their own secure portal. So what medical sees is a little different from law enforcement, which is different from the lab and the prosecutor. And I'm going to show you some screenshots of that very quickly here in a minute. Even though Track It is being used in these other states, it is customizable to each state. So the Texas version looks different than all of the others. As you can imagine, one of the challenges I will talk about later is our tracking system has to be different than the one being used in Washington State or Michigan. There are other states that are tracking sexual assault kits that aren't using Track It, such as Idaho. Idaho was one of the very first. They created it in-house. And when I started in this position in December of 2017, Idaho actually, I guess, volunteered to give us the software that they had created. And on the surface, you think, this is amazing. What a gift. They're going to give the state of Texas this tracking software. But as we looked at it, one of the main issues we saw is you cannot compare the response to sexual assault in Idaho to what we do here in Texas. On average, they have about 450 sexual assaults a year, okay? 450 a year. It's very, very different. They have one crime lab, okay, that processes DNA evidence. So the fact that we can customize this to Texas and get it to meet the various workflows was significant for us. So the medical facility portal, this is where the collection obviously starts. So the same nurse or ER doctor, whoever's done the collection, they will finish the collection and then they'll enter it in to track it. This is what they see. They'll see at the top the barcode, the status, and the kit expiration date. They're only required to enter those 4 things. It's who collected it, the date that it was collected, if consent for forensic testing was given, and if they say yes, then they have to let TrackIt know who the law enforcement agency is that will be receiving that kit. If they say no, it defaults and lets them know that that kit should be going to the DPS Bio Warehouse here in Houston, because a non-report kit should not be held at medical, and it should not go to law enforcement. It should only be going to the DPS Bio Warehouse. So those are the only required mandatory fields based off of recommendation from medical programs across the state. They had asked that we would add the courier fields in case they have to ship a kit, especially for those non-report kits. They wanted to be able to add that information in there as well. And then some programs wanted the release to law enforcement field. Why is that important? Because you will see here in a minute, TrackIt goes against everything that we've talked about today, because TrackIt is not chain of custody. It was not intended to replace chain of custody. It is only scan in, it is not scan out. So where we have all been trained that you sign it in, you sign it out, that happens everywhere that it goes and moves. TrackIt is kind of the opposite of that. It is only scan in. So some medical facilities wanted to be able to note when they actually handed it off to the law enforcement agency, so we added that field for them. Additional evidence collected, that field is important to us here in Texas because I didn't spend a lot of time on the legislation, but it was actually written and it says sexual assault evidence. It doesn't say kit. So there was some confusion early on about what the intent of the legislation was, and we reached back out to the bill author, and her intent was that the kit would be tracked along with the additional items of evidence that are collected at the time of the medical exam. So to kind of cover that, even though we're not going to track those additional items of evidence, we are going to note within TrackIt that they do exist. So by doing so, here on this screen, the medical facility for the first time is giving everyone else down the line the opportunity to see that that exists. Whereas before, maybe only law enforcement knew they had those items, but now the lab will be able to see that they exist, so that if the kit is negative, they can request that they submit those additional items for testing. For prosecutors, that could be significant, because at the end, when you're trying to decide if a case is going to move forward and you need to know, has all of the evidence been tested, they will be able to see that and be able to ask some follow-up questions. So once medical has entered their required information and they hit save, it does 2 things. One, it notifies law enforcement that there is a kit that's ready to be picked up, and it activates the survivor's account so they can start tracking it. So once law enforcement picks up the kit, they scan it in, and they see a screen that looks like this. There are only 2 required fields. It is the date that they picked it up from the medical facility and their LEA case number. This is significant because a lot of people have asked, law enforcement agencies have said, should it be the cop at the hospital that scans it in immediately, or can it wait till it hits our property room? And the DPS response to that is a policy decision, but best practice is that this gets updated as soon as possible. Keeping in mind, if your property room is Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and you have a patrol officer that picks up this kit on Friday at 5 p.m., all weekend it's going to look to the survivor like you haven't picked it up, okay? And that could cause some concerns and issues. not only for the survivor, but for potentially the medical facility, because they could be getting calls like, why hasn't law enforcement picked it up? And really the kit is gone. Once the laboratory receives it, so once again, once law enforcement receives it into their possession, they don't scan it out when they take it to the lab. The next time that it gets scanned is when it's received by the lab. The lab can see everything that has happened with that kit prior to the submission to the lab. They're only required to enter their case number and the date it was received by the lab. They hit confirm receipt and they are now done. It stays in the lab until DNA processing is complete. What do I mean by DNA processing? It depends on the kit, right? Sometimes it may be completed after the screening process if the kit was negative and it's not going to be forwarded for DNA analysis. That would be considered complete. But we are asking the DNA labs to go back in post-analysis, scan in the kit, and give us some what we call reporting conclusions. The basic design of Track It requires for the lab completion date to be entered and then whether or not that evidence is ready to be picked up by law enforcement. Here in Texas, we've gone a little bit further. We want to know those 3 processing details. The first one being, was a CODIS eligible DNA profile obtained? Yes or no? That question kind of encompasses the other second half of that. We're assuming that if it was obtained, that it has been entered into CODIS. We actually originally had that question broken out into 2. Was it obtained and was it entered? And we thought, well, that's kind of silly because we're going to assume that our labs are doing the right thing, and if it was obtained, it's going to be entered. So we put them back together. And then we want to know about CODIS hits. This is probably the #1 question we're being asked now by the legislature is all of the money and time that's being spent processing sexual assault kits, how often are we getting results from them? And on the statewide level, we didn't know. Just like the numbers related to how many sexual assault kits are collected in Texas, we didn't know prior to Track It, and hopefully Track It will give us those numbers. But yeah, as we move forward, the CODIS piece of this is going to become more and more significant. Once the lab has completed processing, law enforcement goes back and picks it up. Everything that they entered before is retained within the system. So if they entered that the assigned officer was Eric Berry and that's their LEA case number, it's still there. So really all they have to do is enter the date that they picked it up from the lab and confirm pickup. At that point, that kit is considered tracking complete within Track It. We don't expect for the kit to move anywhere else. Now, will the kit go to court for trial? Yes, it may. Which is another common question we get is investigators with DA's offices, do they need to have access to Track It, and do they have the law enforcement portal, or do they get the prosecutor portal? And my question is always, well, what is your workflow? Because if your investigator at the DA's office doesn't actually ever pick up a sexual assault kit from a medical facility and you aren't the investigating agency, then no, they don't need access as a law enforcement agency. Because within Track It, the law enforcement agency can note if it's just going to court. There's a field where they can note that it's going to a possessing external entity, and they would note that it's for trial purposes. So that's also kind of covered in there. The prosecutor portal is unique to Track It because while all of the other user groups are required to not only use it but enter data within the system, the prosecutor portal right now is read-only. I say right now because when we demoed this for the bill author in the spring, just to kind of give her an update on where we were at and what it looked like, she said, I love it, but where does the prosecutor enter the results of the case? And we said, well, right now they don't. So I fully expect that as legislative sessions pass and there's hopefully some more interest in it, that this could change. But as of right now, the prosecutors have read-only access. They can query a case by any of the fields that are in there. So if they know who the investigating officer is, the LEA case number, the lab number, we don't really expect most of the time they're going to know the barcode. But they have the ability to query by any of those things, and they pull it up, and this is what they will see, all the history of that kit. They can also see or sort by different things, which I think would be helpful if they want to see how many of my kits are currently, or my cases are currently pending DNA analysis, or how many have never been sent to the lab. They can sort and filter by those sorts of things as well. So the survivor portal, very quickly, we have in there resources for them. We remind them of whether or not they gave consent for forensic testing, all of those sorts of things. But I just want to show you today, probably the most important thing for them is the kit status timeline. All of so that you can see everything that has been entered into those other portals, what it looks like to the survivor. So all of the most recent things are always going to be in the top, so it's in reverse chronological order. This is the kit that I just walked you through, so it's considered tracking complete. You'll notice it says in law enforcement possession. That red Montgomery Police Department, that's actually a link. If they click on that, it's going to take them to the contact information for that law enforcement agency. It's got the generic statement just telling them that the kit's processing has been completed. It's now being stored there. One thing that we changed here in Texas that I'm probably the most proud of is we put on the survivor's timeline that the lab processing is complete and the date that the lab shows that. So all of the other versions of Track-It that are being used across the country, the survivor doesn't get to see that. And I think it kind of went against the intent of what Representative Howard was trying to do, which was empower the survivor and to give them information. So we're not, notice we just tell them that processing has been complete and to contact law enforcement. We're not telling them if there was a CODIS hit. We're not telling them if a DNA profile was obtained. We're not doing any of that in here. We're just letting them know that the lab has completed processing and directing them back to law enforcement. As it continues to flow, you'll just notice it gives the dates of when it was received in the lab, when law enforcement took possession of it, all the way back to the medical facility. In this case, it was El Paso Medical who collected it. So once again, that is a link. If they click on that, it'll give them contact information. All of the contact informations for medical facility and law enforcement agencies, that is what the agency gives to us. So that's not DPS giving them your private cell phone number or anything like that. That is what you have given us permission to share with the survivor. So challenges, we've already talked about a little bit. Everything's bigger in Texas, right? So compared to Idaho, not just sheer volume, but the geographical distance that we cover, the numbers within the user groups, right? Like how many hospitals, medical facilities, urgent care clinics, all of these places that could potentially collect sexual assault kits. It's a huge number. Law enforcement agencies alone, there's over 2,000. And then crime labs, we've got, now I'm gonna freeze. Is it 16, 17 processing DNA right now?
17.
17, thank you. So that made it unique as well. Various workflows. We learned, or I learned very quickly that the Dallas-Fort Worth area here in Texas was unique in the workflow. So here in Harris County, y'all have the basic workflow that we see statewide, which is what we just talked about. It goes from the medical facility to law enforcement to the crime lab and back to law enforcement. Well, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, medical collects it, they stick it in a lockbox, and the lab would pick it up directly from that lockbox. So that created issues within Track-It that we wanted to identify and to be able to work with, because we didn't want them to have to change their workflow to accommodate Track-It. So we actually asked the vendor to redesign that. And while we're redesigning that, it slowed us down on some of the other features we would like to see eventually in place. But we did want to accommodate the different workflow. A lot of that we're doing through customization. What I showed you today and what has been implemented here in Texas in September of 2019, I do not think will look the same next September, because we will continually be trying to update it based on user feedback so that it can be user-friendly and provide the information that we need to provide to the different groups. A big challenge here in Texas too was when they first told me we were going to start tracking sexual assault kits. I was like, that's a great idea. And then I realized there wasn't even a barcode on the kit. So how are we going to get that done, right? You know, it's just like basic things. At the time, Texas A&M was already working with the Office of the Attorney General on the redesign of the standardized kit here in Texas because it had not been updated in 20 years. Has science changed in 20 years? Just a little bit. So I got lucky in that they were already redesigning it. I kind of jumped on board that project with them, and I asked them, hey, can you include what I need so that we can track? And they agreed, and they've been great ever since. So yeah, the original kit did not contain a barcode. All of the kits that are currently out in inventory, DPS is providing the barcode for those kits. It looks like that. It just says TXSAE tracking system, and then that is the survivor card. It is the size of a business card. It only contains the URL, their username, which is the barcode, and a password. It is very plain and boring, and that was at the recommendation of advocacy around the state. They said in a lot of cases of domestic violence, a survivor isn't going to want to leave a hospital with something that's branded real big and says track it, right? So that is by design that it looks that way. The new kits that should start shipping hopefully next week or early October from both Cerci and Tritech, both vendors. That barcode will already be on the box. It's going to be in 3 locations. That was at the recommendation of evidence and property room personnel who said, don't just put it on the lid, can you put it on the long side and the short side too, because depending on how we store them, if we need to scan it, it would be easier for us. And I was like, yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. Once again, this is why collaboration is so important, because I would have never thought of that on my own. So that survivor card will be inside the kit, and it'll be pre-labeled from the vendors. We talked a little bit right now that one of the biggest challenges we're facing is not only do these kits not have barcodes on, so we're relying on the SANES or law enforcement, or worst case scenario, we're barcoding them when they hit our labs. Our labs are kind of like the last defense of making sure that these kits are being tracked. But that's kind of been a challenge for us, is to make sure that they're getting labeled properly. So we're hopeful that once the new kits start rolling out and everyone sees that there is a barcode on the kit, that'll also be a trigger to remember, I need to enter it and track it. And most important to me personally is engagement. Like I talked about earlier, we recognized in early 2019 that we were going to have to do a pilot here in Texas. I didn't want to, it scared me, but we knew that we were going to have to test some of the new functionality and the customization of Track It for Texas. And so I reached out to a couple different cities for a variety of reasons. We started in Arlington because they were part of the customization of that different type of workflow. And then I thought, well, this is good, but they do not use a DPS lab, and so I didn't want it to be fine in everyone else, but then the kits within our own labs were failing. So we brought on board DPS El Paso and the El Paso community, along with Lubbock and Amarillo, because they had an interest. And then I made my way to Houston, and I knew what was going to happen here, which I think is a testament to all the great work that y'all do, because when I said, and we have these 4 pilot locations, the city of Houston responded and said, hey, why not us? And I was like, I expected y'all to want to jump on board. And really and honestly, without Houston, the pilot wouldn't have been nearly as helpful to us, just because of the volume that y'all do here in Houston. Actually, I left the numbers over there, but I do want to provide you with that. I think it's important to know that right now, thanks. I brought numbers. I typically haven't been sharing them yet, just because it's so early in the process, but because I am grateful to all of the work that y'all are doing, I think it's important to share that with you. So last night, as of 6 p.m., we were currently tracking 930 kits. Some of those are prior to September 1st because of the pilot group. Just since September 1, there's been 698 that we're tracking. I did some quick math to see if we stay on this pace, what does that give us for a full calendar year, and it would be right around 10,000 sexual assault kits collected in Texas. There have been a variety of estimates. I think the highest I've ever seen is about 15,000. So keeping in mind, once again, I'm not naive. Are we still missing kits? Yeah, possibly. but I think we're doing an excellent job because of everyone who has been engaged to this point, and the fact that our labs, even though we have 17 that are processing DNA, they have been overly supportive of Track It. I do believe we're getting a good number because if all else fails, when it's hitting the lab, it's being tracked for the first time. And I think that's really all that I have today. I also want to echo what's already been said and thank the Houston Forensic Science Center for putting these types of things together. I have learned that throughout the state, where we are struggling the most is where there aren't these types of things and people aren't talking and they don't know what they could be doing to make somebody else's job easier and vice versa. So I just applaud y'all for what y'all are doing here in the Houston area. Thank you.
There we go, Lieutenant Peters.
Hello, my name is Lieutenant Kenneth Peters. I'm with the Houston Police Department with the Property Room Division. Just a little bit about myself. I used to be on the tactical unit. Basically what that means is we picked up prostitutes, bought narcotics, done undercover stuff, done surveillance. So there's a number of different things that I've done with that tactical unit. Also, I spent a couple years as a burglary and theft investigator. And if the truth were told, that I really did not give evidence much of a thought when I was an officer. We picked it up, we tried to preserve it, but once it went into the property room, that's the last I thought of it. But evidence is very critical in our cases. It's critical in the sense of that it determines the guilt or innocence of a person. And that's very important because we don't want anyone who's innocent being placed into our system. But also we want to make sure those who are guilty, that the evidence is preserved to give them a fair trial. And so now, since I've been lieutenant over the property room, now I give it a whole lot of thought, because we want to preserve the evidence to make sure that we giving criminals or even those who are innocent a fair chance in our system. So in the HPD property room is what I'm over. In the HPD property room, we have a commander and we have 2 lieutenants. I'm being one of the lieutenants. I'm going to give you a history of the property room, the evidence tagging process and procedures, and then our current guidelines for the police department on tagging evidence, and then the certification that we received just a few years ago. It's not working. There we go. Originally, the Houston Police Department property room started at 1103 Goliad. The building was built in 1902. It was not necessary, it wasn't designed to be a property room, it was really designed to be a warehouse. Just like most property rooms in the nation, it was not designed for storage or property or evidence. For more than 3 decades, the property room was located at 1103 Goliad. And they began using it as a property room back in 1967, which I think is probably is older than most of you in here. But it was not even designed to be a property room. They made it out of a property room because evidence was necessary. But after numerous well-publicized incidents associated with the Goliad facility, the city commission, the Bromwich report, had us to change that. There we go. This is the old property room that was built in 1902. Does it look like it's been built in 1902? And so this is where we used to store evidence. And that building still exists to this day. Now, we don't store evidence there anymore, Now we kind of use it as a storage facility such as cabinets, old office equipment. It's not used as evidence, but this is what we used to use. Anyone want a bicycle? You get a bicycle. You get a bicycle. Dr. Stout gets 2 bicycles. This is what it looks like. It used to look this way. Tell me which one is a homicide case and tell me which bicycle is found property. It's very difficult to tell. This was our evidence storage. We put toe tags on everything. This is homicide cases, burglary cases, robbery cases, assault cases. This is what the challenges that we used to have. Here's some other challenges. As you can see, there's lawnmowers, buggies, wires, all those things thrown across the floor. This is evidence in cases. We've had all kind of evidence that come into the property room. We've had anything from jewelry to bicycles to car bumpers to car doors to coffins. Anything dealing with any kind of criminal investigation, we've had it come through the property room. And I know y'all are wondering, well, where did you get a coffin from? That's a story for another time. Here you see like air conditioners, safes, all of those things on the ground. It just looked like it's so disorganized. And this is what the Brownwich report, this is what it revealed. Here's some storage places. Some of the evidence that's stored, you see boxes on the ground, you see, how do you determine on which evidence is which? 1202 Washington is where our property room is now. The report was completed in 2007 and spurred construction of a new facility in the same year. The new property room opened on June 19, 2009 and is located at 1202 Washington Avenue. On June 19, 2009, the new facility opened with assurance that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Because we wanted to get ahead of, we wanted to make sure we were innovative in what we did as far as the property room. We want to make sure that everyone got a fair shake when it came to the justice system. Now, we still have challenges. We work with Dr. Stout, we work with the DA's office to make sure that we're trying to eliminate as much as we possibly can mistakes that are made in the property room. We've had discussions, I'd probably say debate, with Dr. Stout and the DA's office. But the challenges and the debates and the discussions is necessary so that we can move forward even in the future. Here's the construction of the new property room. It's a total of 59,000 total square feet. The new property room, here's the officers' parking area. And that door that you see is where the officers enter. And you can notice there's little covered parking that's there, so we try to preserve the evidence once they get out of the car because it rained that particular day, so we don't want the evidence getting wet. We want to make sure that we preserve it as much as we possibly can, especially when we get it from the officers to the property room to wherever we're going to store it. And here's some friendly faces in the property room that you'll encounter. And I don't know if you can see in the very back, I know we probably have some Rice University people, but there's a cougar. Go Cougs, I'm University of Houston. But there's a cougar that was part of, it was confiscated, I think, in some kind of a burglary case. Nobody ever came back to claim the cougar, so it became our mascot. Here's an officer's workroom. The officers have the opportunity to come in and enter the information so that way they don't have to sit out in their cars. They come in and enter the information so we can get ready to bring it into our property room to tag it so it can be stored. Now here's the customers area, our citizens area. They come in from a different side of the building. and within that little window there, they kind of talk with the citizens. Sometimes citizens come in to gain their property. They're trying to retrieve their property back. There's times where they may think that we have some things. Sometimes we do not. You probably wonder why is it different interest for the police officers and the citizens? Well, police officers bringing in evidence, and you want them to preserve the evidence as much as possible, so you don't want to contaminate it with citizens coming in, maybe, they may touch it or whatever the case may be. So we created the separate entrances so that we can preserve the evidence as much as we possibly could. Y'all remember the storage area? All the boxes, all the toe tags, all the tags that you couldn't determine on what was what. Well, here's the new property room. A lot differently, isn't it? Because now we want to be able to find those items. We want to be able to keep the accuracy of those items. So when the district attorney's office, hey, we want this particular evidence, we can find that evidence in a timely manner. Here's a walk-in freezer. Some things need to be frozen in order to maintain the evidence. So that way we don't contaminate, we have enough information so that when it's tested or if it's brought back from testing, whatever the case may be, we have a place to store it. If they need it frozen, we can freeze it. If we have a dryer where if it needs to be placed in a dryer, we place it in the dryer. Whatever's necessary so that we can make sure we preserve the evidence. Weapons room. To the right, you see envelopes with guns in it. And all those different envelopes, you had to circle around and you had to go around and try to figure out, okay, which gun belonged to which case. On the left is now the new property room where we store guns. You see the different boxes. And I don't know if you can see the... Oh, am I on the wrong one? Oh, there we go. You see that, the envelopes? Those had guns in it. That's the new property room. And so what we've done, we've placed the guns in the box to preserve them. At the bottom shelf, you see those guns on the table, and the bottom shelf, the guns are open. Those guns are going to be destroyed. We put them there because we're going to destroy all the guns. Well, I know you say, well, how come you don't sell the guns? Well, we want to take guns off the streets, plain and simple. We don't want to put guns back on the street because of the danger of the guns. Some guns may cost $3,000. Some guns may cost $200. Doesn't matter. We cut them up and we get rid of them, we dispose of them. Now, the city is very innovative. They decide, well, we're going to sell the metal back. Well, we only get about $50 for a barrel of that metal, whereas you may have destroyed $30,000 worth of guns. But the objective is not to put the guns back onto the street. This is one of the process of where the guns are destroyed. The gentlemen, the people who are sitting down, they're the lieutenants. Each lieutenant has to verify the serial number of the gun. So if you take one gun, each lieutenant has to verify that serial number to make sure that they're destroying the correct gun. If there's a discrepancy at any point, then that gun is held back. And that goes for any of our other evidence, not so much to this magnitude, but we want to make sure that we verify that if we're destroying it, that is what needs to be destroyed. And I don't know if this video is going to play. Yeah, the video's not going to play, but the way we destroy guns is called JAWS. We brought in a destruction machine in which the guns are placed into that machine, and as the machine runs, when they lower it down, it cuts the guns in half. It cuts it into like 3 different pieces. So that way the guns can never be used ever again. Now here's some of the functions of the property room. Stop. What's the problem? Okay. Here's some of the function of the property room. The police officer, he brings in the gun into intake. Now, several things happen once we take it into the property room. The property could be returned back to the owner, and what we try to do is attempt to find the owner of the property. Here's a common mistake that most people make when they're looking for their property. We do not write down our serial numbers. Probably all of you in here have a television. Probably none of you have the serial number written down. We have thousands of televisions. Looking for the owner without the serial number is probably zero. Every now and then we may find one, but it's very challenging. So here's a little tidbit. Write down your serial number. We probably have it in the property room. But we try to do everything that we can to return it to the owner. Also, when the officer brings it in, the other thing that may be done is we hold it, for court investigation, or hold it for evidence for the court cases. Also, it may be held over for investigation. Sometimes some people have property that come in, and we're still investigating, trying to determine on if this evidence is a part of the criminal case or it hasn't been found, whatever the case may be. After it goes through the process, whether the district attorney's office or whether the investigation property owner, then it has to be disposed of. One way of disposing of it, sometimes we destroy it like we do the guns. But then also there are times where we basically sell it to propertyroom.com. What they'll do is they'll go and they'll resell it to somebody at pretty good rate. I'll just tell you that. So it's propertyroom.com. I know you're writing it down, so if you need a television at a cheap price, propertyroom.com. Now here's some HPD Property Division upgraded information system, because we had to keep up with how do we keep up with this evidence, how do we know where it is, how to retrieve it, where is it inside the warehouse, how can we know to go directly to it. So this was created. So we have what we call RMS, Records Management System. Items entered into the RMS that is now sent to the EMS, the Evidence Management System. RMS is basically the report in which the officers write, and once it get there, we kind of get it, enter it in, it goes into the Evidence Management System. Then item info is transferred to the lab system when picked up, which is HFSC. What happens is eliminate handwritten submission paperwork, reduce amount of the entry done to intake and HFSC, reduce submission and intake errors. Data is more consistent throughout the organization. So this is one way to eliminate as many errors as we possibly can. And so it kind of just gives us a backup system. That way if we don't catch the error on the front end, maybe we can catch it on the back end. Some of those systems are what we call the Beast. The Beast is basically a barcoded system. And you see the barcode on the right. And so the barcode is generated, so they scan the barcode and it enters into the Beast. And so the Beast lets us know, hey, it's going to be stored in this location, or it's going to be stored in this particular warehouse, wherever the case may be. And then there's a wireless receiver inside the warehouse. So that way, when they scan the location, they scan inside the warehouse. That way we can go directly to where that evidence and where that property is. If you remember on the first slide where it had all those tags, it was just sitting there, so you had to go through each and every single case number to say, this is the evidence we're looking for. Probably took hours. Now it takes minutes. And this is what we use to kind of scan, the handheld scanner, scan that in. Recently, we went to electronic e-signature to make it easier for the officers. So now when they tag in evidence, they sign the e-signature pad, and now that becomes permanent record. We used to have where they would bring in the paperwork, so we had to store those files and files and files and files of paper. Guess what happens? Eventually you run out of room. So now we go into e-signature so it can be stored, and now that's record now forever. This happened on October 17, 2018. E-signature is now required for all evidence tagged in the property division. And this is a certificate that we got for e-signature from the Administration and Regulatory Affairs Department and Records Manager's Office. And then here's our current policies on it. Our general order, which is our policy, 700-01, property and evidence control. Any employee who originally takes custody of the property is responsible for making an original incident. So when the officer brings in, he has to make a report. He has to do a report on it. Otherwise, we will not take it without a report. When the property is logged in or out or transferred, a supplement to the original report will be made by the employee handling the property. So you heard Mr. Doyle say that they didn't know who handled what, or anytime anyone come in and handle property from our standpoint, then we're going to supplement that report to let you know that, hey, such and such person had checked this property out, whether it's going to court or for investigation, so that way we know the chain of custody. Requests by others for viewing of evidentiary property. So we have, they may request it. And so normally we kind of partner with the DA's office, so that way whatever request by defense attorneys, we can all be on the same page. The employee shall also supplement the case showing date, time, time the property was checked out, reason for checking it out, date, time property was returned. The following item of prisoner property shall be tagged in the HPD property room. We have firearms or prohibited weapons, large items such as luggage, boxes, computers, or bicycles, property of unknown ownership or not belonging to the prisoner, unopened beer, wine, or liquor, non-perishable food items excluding single serving size. So we take a little bit of everything inside the property room. And this is our certification. ISO is recognized nationally for our certification program. We were certified through ISO, the property room was certified through ISO. ISO set out the criteria for a quality management system. Using ISO 9001-2015 was the last certification for us. It ensures that customers receive consistent, good quality products and services. The property division was certified on September 5th, 2011, and has undergone biannual surveillance audits. We just recently had an audit back February of this year. We have 8 quality management principles. We're customer focused, leadership, involvement of people, process approach, system approach to management, continual improvement, factual approach to decision making, mutually beneficial supplier relationships. So we're customer focused. Our customers include other police agencies, the district attorney's office, HFSC, even you as a citizen. So we want to make sure that we're doing the best we can for the public. Leadership, we make sure we have everyone involved. We have quarterly meetings with our employees to make sure that we're trying to eliminate whatever mistakes that we may have, and also that they know the process. We try to ensure that they know the process, and if they don't, we send them back through training, or whether with a supervisor or with some lead person. And this is our ISO banner that we're very proud of because it's very difficult to get certified as a property room, especially by ISO. There are a number of steps that you have to go through. And if it's not correct, they will not certify you. And I just thank you, and I thank these the panelists for working with them. We've all worked together. We're all on the same. We're all doing the same job, looking for the same results. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all the speakers. We will take a little bit of a break here, about 20 minutes, and come back for discussion, questions. There's more tacos back there, coffee. Please enjoy. So we'll start back at 10:50.